Hello and welcome to the VSC Healing Begins Here podcast series. The Victim Service Center, or the VSC, is a nonprofit organization that provides free, individualized counseling and other services to survivors of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. In recognition for Black History Month, which is in February, and Women's History Month, which is in March, today we'll be talking about violence against Black women as it pertains to domestic and sexual violence. Research shows that for every Black woman who reports a rape, at least 15 Black women do not report. In addition to this, more than 40% of Black women have experienced intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and/or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. In this episode, we have three amazing African American women who will help us understand what causes this violence to be inflicted on Black women, and also how we as individuals and a community can help prevent it from happening. And to start us off, I have with me the one and only Lisa Alexander. Hi. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Lisa, can you start off by sharing with us a little bit more about what you do and who you are?
So I'm the founder and executive director of Stand Up Survivor. We're a nonprofit located here in Orlando, supporting survivors of domestic violence.
Can you discuss the impact of historical traumas, such as Jim Crow laws and other policies that are in place that have perpetuated this domestic violence against Black women?
Well, I think, honestly, it stems back a long time ago where, families were separated, Black men were taken out of the homes, the women were they were raped, they were attacked by their slave owners. And so families have been separated for a long time in the Black community. So when we look at the violence against women, we have men out of the homes, we have women who are trying to survive and maintain, and it's been really difficult for them to be able to do so.
Recently, we've been hearing more about unconscious bias, stereotypes, microaggressions that are perpetuated against people of color, and especially women of color, as it pertains to domestic violence. So as the founder, in your experience, what would you say are some common stereotypes and misrepresentations of Black women that perpetuate this violence against them?
I think I'll start with the angry Black woman, right? They're assuming that we're just Black and that we're angry. And it's just such a false narrative about who we are. I know for myself, when I was married to my abuser, I didn't see anyone that looked like me, who that had escaped an abusive relationship, had healed and was thriving in life after. And I think we need to showcase more of Black women who are surviving and thriving after abuse to give a mirror image to other Black women who are experiencing domestic violence. One of the hardest things as Black women to do is call the police on our Black men, to call the police and say, he's hurting me, because then we feel as though we're perpetuating the cycle of abuse against men and violence against men and arrest against men, which is not intentional, but we have that fear. And so oftentimes we don't pick up the phone to call the police because we don't want to do that to our Black men, but we're suffering abuse.
That actually goes to show that the reason why a lot of women stay in these relationships, these abusive relationships, is because of, one, the fear, the two, of the stereotypes that are once again perpetuated against women and people of color. Yeah. They don't want their community to continue to be targeted and for people to continue to feel these negative beliefs about them. Yeah. So that just goes to show how social institutions can prevent or are prevented from helping these individuals.
Yeah, and our goal would be to keep our family together, because we were torn apart, we were ripped apart during slave times, and after that we were ripped apart as families. So, I don't want my kids to grow up in a home without both parents. I want my kids to grow up with both parents in the home, or to know who their father is, or I don't want to be a single mom. There's a stereotype about Black women who are single moms and on welfare. And so to try to step away from that, we do our best to keep our families together, while the detriment to us physically and emotionally to ourselves and our children.
Based on your experience as a person of color and as someone who has been through an abusive relationship, how was it during your experience when you realized that your relationship was abusive and you wanted to get out? Did you get the help and the support that you needed from social institutions?
Well, the night that I escaped with my children, they were 2 and 3 at the time, I'd watched a video of a Black woman. It's the first time I'd ever seen it. And she was sharing her story of how she was in an abusive relationship, how she got out, and how she escaped. Mm-hmm. And it's that night that I packed my children and I left, because I saw someone who looked like me, and I said to myself, if she can do it, I can do it too. And I left a note on the counter, I packed my kids in the car, and I escaped. And I thought to myself, there's hope. And that's the goal of what we do at Stand Up Survivor. I want women to look and say, hey, she can do it, I can do it too. So, there are resources available. And so I started Stand Up Survivor because I did see some gaps in the system. Number one being a Black woman that looked like me who had survived and thrived. Mm-hmm. But there are resources out there available, and we can't be afraid to ask for them for help.
What do you think, based on your experience once again, that can be done to increase this visibility and to help people who are in this situation that, hey, there is help out there, there are resources that can help you get out of it? What do you think can increase that visibility, and what resources would you recommend to these individuals?
So I love that question. I think it's fabulous. I think what's really important is that give Black women, Black survivors a seat at the table. Don't make decisions for us as survivors. Ask survivors what they need, and survivors will tell you, but no one's asking. Oftentimes people want to make decisions for survivors, but they're not asking what that looks like. And so people are making decisions for survivors and domestic violence organizations that look nothing like us. They want to bring us to the table when it's a Black round table or a Black conversation or a focus on the Black community. But what about the everyday community? Because Black people live in everyday communities. They live in everyday neighborhoods. They go to everyday schools. So why are we not at the table every time? So for me, and I get really passionate about this because I've been doing this is my 8th year doing my nonprofit organization. And to get a seat at a lot of these tables, it's almost impossible. And so you have to prove yourself so much more than a white person would have to be in my same exact position, education level, and experience. And so give us a seat at the table. We desire for you to hear our voices. And the catapult for me to leave, right, was seeing another Black woman thrive. And since our organization, we reached almost 500,000 people a month, empowering survivors to leave and heal and save their lives and their children. We have done this right here in Central Florida because I saw a woman who looked like me. And so I want to do that for and I continue to do that for other survivors. So, they say, don't wait for somebody to offer you a seat at the table. But with that question, it tells me, give us a seat at the table so we can help those in our community.
How can allies and organizations like the VSC and others out there, how can we be there to support and let people of color who are in these relationships and in these situations know that we're there and we can support you? Like, what can individuals do also, like myself, outside of work?
Well, I love it. The VSC is an amazing partner. One of the things that we do is we refer clients to each other, which is really, really important. It shows that we are connected together. But I think also showing people, give the person the mic in the front of the room that looks like who we're trying to impact. Are we reaching? Do we have outreach services in the communities and in the schools and in the community centers where Black and African American and brown people exist? Or do we have the language? Do we have the Spanish? Do we have the Portuguese? Do we have the Creole? Do we have the languages spoken by the people that we're trying to reach? We can't sit on a podium so far back and say, hey, we're here to help you, come on up. And I think it's just so important to recognize that sometimes because of the discrepancies within the African American community, we need a little bit more extra help. Give them the extra help. And I think it's always really important to show Black and brown faces just as much as you show the other faces.
Lisa, the last question that I have for you today is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to a survivor right now who is in a situation, they're in a domestic violence relationship, they want to leave, but they don't know how to?
Oh my goodness. So I would say that there is love and peace and safety and joy on the other side of what you're going through. I always say that if I knew the life that I live now was on the other side, I would have left a long time ago. And so I always say, if I can have just a little bit of hope for you, hopefully that's enough to get you through that door. And don't be afraid of what's on the other side. Be more afraid to stay and to think that this is a life you have to live forever. But what if I told you that hope and joy existed on the other side? I'm living here. I'm a living witness sitting here telling you that there's life outside of abuse. And it's a really, really good life. And so I just want to encourage whoever's listening that may be experiencing domestic violence to just have a little bit of hope, just a little bit, and there's no expectations. We're just here to love you through the process of getting out.
Lisa, thank you so much for your words of wisdom, your words of advice, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
When we come back, we will be joined by Natalie Summers, who is one of our contract therapists at the Victim Service Center, to further the conversation on sexual violence against Black women. So don't go away. Welcome back to the VSC Healing Begins Here podcast series. In this next segment, we are joined by Natalie to learn more about sexual violence as it pertains to Black women. Natalie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
To start off, can you share with us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm Natalie Summers, licensed mental health counselor, as well as a contract therapist with Victim Service Center of Central Florida. I have been in the Central Florida area for over 10 years, working in healing and healing-informed care for over 7 years. Specifically with VSC, I assist clients in the therapeutic services, assisting them with sexual assault, domestic violence, childhood traumas, and other tragic circumstances.
Wow, you have a lot of experience, Natalie.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to set the stage, the first question that I want to ask you today is, based on your experience, what are the unique experiences, I know I keep saying the word experience,
that's
faced
fine.
by Black women as it pertains to sexual violence?
Well, to be honest, it's devastating across the board. However, it's as Black females, or those that identify as Black females, some of the traumas that they face in sexual assault are just the barriers of crossing into, crossing into reporting, even going back to slavery days. Sometimes they were viewed as objects. And so the lack of trust with the systems, the lack of just overall, just within their systemic environment. So some of the pressures that they had there, as well as just in their own community, sometimes just people not legitimizing their stories.
Based on what you just said about the systemic barriers that Black women face, I want to go into that a little more. Based on what you're seeing, like in the news, based on, once again, on your own experience, what are some of the inequities and other barriers that Black women face as it relates to sexual violence?
Well, that's huge. It really is. So some of the barriers, for instance, would be, let's start like socially. We have social stigmas. And so some of those social stigmas are, is it true? Is your story really legitimate? And then the other side of that is, if there's a sexual assault, if I report it, statistics have shown most of the violators or perpetrators are other men of color. So if we go back to slavery days, we look at how the oppressors may have been whites. And so when we look at systemically, most of the representation may be white males. And so them not reporting also feels as though they're betraying their community.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is they may keep it within, which then they don't share it with anyone. So then that creates barriers of shame and guilt and other things that then get passed on as multi-generational traumas. And so that's one huge impact. And then, like you said, in the media, sometimes they report and sometimes they don't. And so most of the time it's even more dramatic and more appalling from that perspective.
And based on my research as well, what I've been noticing and seeing is that a lot of the times when Black women do come forward and they do call law enforcement and they do call upon social institutions to help them and to provide them with that support and those resources, a lot of the times they don't get the help that they need in that moment. A lot of the times people have biases, like we all have biases,
Right.
and they take those biases and it affects their healing journey, because now that reinforces their belief that, okay, I'm in help, but I'm a Black woman, and because of that, I'm not going to get what I need. So what would you say is the reason that, I know we talked about it a little bit, but what would you say, could you talk more about the impact that stereotypes, biases, microaggressions have when it comes to Black women as they report their violence?
Yeah, honestly, we saw a huge turn, I would say maybe in 2006 when Tarina Burke started the Me Too movement. So part of that started, however, it didn't really catapult until it got more of a push. Unfortunately, after some other powerful men like Harvey Weinstein and, you know, in the Hollywood and in the entertainment industry. And so even after that, even if they reported, they may not have been believed, and or there were some other repercussions that were felt.
Right.
And so for Black females, it did start in the Me Too movement, did start in the Black community. However, it did, you know, once it got more, I guess, nationally recognized, Black women then felt as though they were pushed back, you know, so to speak. So that kind of exacerbated some of the own inferior or internal things that were going on. So that was one element. And then, like we said, even within our own community, sometimes it may feel as though you're betraying. and or that you're not dealing with the healing that you need, because it's also that silent treatment, or to keep it inside. And so unfortunately, some women really fall prey to the strong black woman mentality that somewhat perpetuates it as well. So I have to put on a front, I have to wear a mask to perpetrate being strong. And sometimes those that obviously hurts more than it helps.
When we talk about intersectionality, Natalie,
Excuse me.
it's okay. We're referring to different social categories that make up a person. So, for example, I'm not just a woman. I'm a brown woman who speaks English, Spanish, a little bit of broken English because of my culture. So, when we're speaking about sexual violence against Black women, how does intersectionality, so for example, when it comes to race and gender and sexual orientation, intertwine, and how does that perpetuate more violence towards these marginalized communities?
Thank you for asking, because obviously with African American or Black women, they fall prey to sexism as well as racism. And so with intersectionality, that is exactly what you said, is where is understanding the intertwining of multi oppressions with how they correlate. In 2000, for instance, in 2017, someone started or coined the term misogynoir, which it was misogyny against Blacks. And so it really fell prey more in other cultures and different things. But you're right, we have the social stigmas, we also have institutionalization, we have personal stigmas, in other areas that we have to look at it categorically, and sometimes just looking at it as one whole, you have to break it out, because like I said, we fall prey to sexism as well as racism.
Yes. Thank you so much for answering that question. Yeah. So Natalie, how can allies and communities and organizations that do this work, how can we continue to support Black women through their healing journey?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So one is to just empathetically and compassionately, when someone, shares their story, to support them empathetically, but also to educate ourselves. Those of us that may not be, or those that are not in the industry, to just read books or educate yourself with organizations. There are many local, national organizations. There are local organizations within the counseling community who have diversity committees. And so oftentimes there are things that will provide assistance. One site that, has kind of been a go-to is just Cite Black Women. Hashtag CITE Black Women. I'm not endorsing it, but it, but it is a start. And so just educating ourselves, going into the school systems, perhaps even starting with the young people, to give them confidence and communication skills, and letting them know what healthy touching, what healthy measures are and what's inappropriate. So just, I would say, advocating where you know and educating yourself where you don't.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you so much for being here and answering those questions for me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
In our next and final segment, we will be joined by Leslie Pender, who is a licensed mental health counselor, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the VSC Healing Begins Here podcast series. In this final segment, we are joined by Leslie Pender to talk about how domestic and sexual violence impacts the mental health and well-being of Black women. Welcome, Leslie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Of course. To start off, Leslie, can you share with our audience a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. As you said, my name is Leslie Pender. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Orlando. I have a private practice, Seeds of Transition Counseling Services. And the work that I do is mostly geared towards helping individuals in their healing process. And in the beginning of my counseling experience, a lot of the work I did was with Department of Children and Families, and working with mothers who were in the process of reuniting with their children. And a lot of the reason why these children were in the foster care system and removed from the home was due to domestic violence. So a lot of the beginning foundation of my work was working with women who were domestic violence victims and survivors, and also with their children who witnessed that domestic violence as well.
Wow. Leslie, you've had a lot of experience in this field, and based on your current role as a mental health counselor, based on your clients who've dealt and been through domestic and sexual violence, what are the effects that this trauma has on the mental health of Black women in particular?
In particular, in the Black community, one of the things that I've often seen is the result of domestic violence is post-traumatic stress disorder. And some of those symptoms can include depression, it can include increased anxiety. Oftentimes, we see increased suicidal ideation. We also see drug abuse and repeated behaviors of physical abuse. So, oftentimes, when that comes up in the work that I do, we try to address the trauma that is often produced because of the domestic and or sexual violence, and particularly with Black women, because of the differences in socioeconomic status and access to care, oftentimes those symptoms go untreated. And so therefore we're having a community of women who are dealing with their trauma and it's unresolved. And it continues to repeat through generations and generations.
Wow. How would you say the intersection of race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., and different social categories impact the effects that violence has on individuals, people of color, and Black women? That was a loaded question, so take your time.
No problem. Thank you for that. The Women's Leadership and Resource Center at the University of Illinois Chicago has done a lot of research in this particular area, specific to how the impact of racism and other systems of oppression have really kind of created a dynamic for Black women who are dealing with domestic violence and or sexual abuse. So when you talk about the intersection of gender and the intersection of systemic racism, you think about it from the perspective of socioeconomic status, access to care, actual interaction with law enforcement or lack thereof, because oftentimes there have been reports where women would report and oftentimes they weren't believed, or they were to go to receive medical treatment. Oftentimes they weren't believed. So therefore, women will tend to, especially Black women, will tend to suck it up, put on the strong Black woman cape, and not report or not get the care and treatment that they deserve and need to be able to process their trauma.
Can you elaborate more on systemic racism and how discrimination can directly impact the mental health of Black women and people of color in general? Because knowing that there are systems in place, social institutions that are designed to help individuals who are going through crises and who are going through trauma, and knowing that they're not getting the help that they need, can you discuss how exactly this can impact someone's mental health?
Well, the biggest challenge is the access to care. Having the resources due to lack of financial resources that impacts the ability to get care. Finding therapists in these neighborhoods where trauma is, especially trauma from domestic violence, is high. Black women are more likely to experience sexual abuse and domestic trauma than their white counterparts. And so, with that being said, with the systemic oppression and racism, those systems in place that makes it almost impossible to access care, to be able to get the resources that you need, whether it's seeing a therapist, whether it's getting the medical treatment, whether it's being able to have a conversation, to report, because oftentimes if a person of color reports, then the likelihood of them having to go back to the abuser because of financial situations, the lack of finances to be able to move and to remove themselves from the environment is lacking. So therefore, that impact on the mental health, you kind of constantly going through this cycle of I can't do anything. I don't have the help that I need. So therefore, I'll either stay And oftentimes we see that most times the highest percentage of homicide in women is due to Black women is due to intimate partner violence. And so that lack of access to care really impacts depression, anxiety, PTSD, because there's no way that they can get to the care that they desire and need. So therefore, they continuously stay in that situation, and that situation is detrimental to the emotional and mental well-being.
Leslie, when we talk about abuse in domestic violence relationships and sexual violence, abuse isn't isolated. So, for example, there's not just physical abuse that happens, there's also emotional abuse, psychological abuse, mental abuse, etc. Can you elaborate and explain more about the effects that these different types of abuse can have on someone's self-esteem, their self-talk, how they feel about themselves, and what they think?
Some of the clients that I've worked with in the past, when I asked the question, um, why was it challenging for them to leave? Financial abuse is very real, the lack of resources. Oftentimes, we don't talk about that particular aspect of domestic violence. And so, feeling that they are not worthy to be loved in a healthy way impacts their self esteem. And again, kind of going back to what I stated earlier, oftentimes individuals who have been in domestic violent situations have seen that as children. So it goes from generation. It's oftentimes modeled in front of them. So oftentimes, relationships that involve that type of behavior is a normal relationship. And I say normal in air quotes, normal, because there's a sense of normalcy. They haven't seen what a healthy dynamic from a relationship perspective looks like. They haven't seen how someone can love them in a healthy way. It doesn't involve being harmed. It doesn't involve someone demeaning you. So the impact on the psychological aspect of a person's personality is impacted. They often feel that they're not worthy, that they deserve this. And so if that is the case, that they feel that they deserve it, oftentimes that self-talk prevents them from saying, no, I am worthy. I don't deserve this type of abuse, and you make the decision to leave. And again, going back to the financial abuse, oftentimes it's hard for an individual to leave that type of relationship because they have been isolated. They have been told not to work because I'm gonna take care of everything. You don't have to work. Or the person is using their power and control over the finances. So those types of abuse, psychological, emotional, mental, sexual, financial abuse, oftentimes prevents a person from believing that they are worthy to have a healthy love.
Leslie, thank you so much for taking your time to be here today. I appreciate all of your answers. They resonated with me, and I'm sure they resonated with everyone else who's listening as well.
Thank you for having me.
If you would like to learn more about the VSC and our free services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. Call our office line at 407-254-9415 or call our crisis line at 407-500-HEAL. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone.